After the interviews were over, and it was clear that Lauren and I would be moving from South Florida to Milwaukee, we arrived for a brief weekend. Our task was to find a place to live. We were looking for a new home. It was May. The trees were in bloom. The days were becoming warmer. New buds on flower-lined streets were opening with the promise of a new spring, and the sun shone down on the neighborhoods as we explored. Shorewood, Whitefish Bay, Glendale, Bayside, Mequon, Grafton were the neighborhoods we were focused on. As we drove up and down the North Shore, we saw carefully manicured lawns with flags hanging from the doors of quaint, beautiful homes. We saw children on their own riding their bikes, and most precious, and this really sealed the deal for us, we saw children with lemonade stands, sitting on their front lawns, selling lemonade to passerby. This was it. This was where we wanted to raise our children. We still love it after these 6 years, for the promise of a new spring and rebirth that we saw those first days of discovery is true for us. It was later that I started to understand the limit of our scope. So much of our lives are spent on the North Shore. It took a little while to learn that we live a life along latitudinal lines, traveling for the most part north and south along our comfortable neighborhoods. But when I travel west, through the streets that were once the home of the Jewish community, Sherman Park, Poplar, Walnut, and beyond, I don't see lemonade stands. I don't see children playing on the sidewalks. I don't see the promise of a new spring in the eyes of their residents. And so it was this summer that I found myself in Toronto while on vacation, sitting with old friends, days after the riots and fires that burned in Milwaukee, and I was asked, what was going on in my home? First, I realized that Milwaukee is indeed my home. Second, I realized I needed to offer an explanation. In that moment, a string of memories ran through my mind. I remembered the first days of living in Cincinnati and passing through a neighborhood called Over the Rhine, where riots had broken out years before. It was the first ghettoized neighborhood I had experienced in North America. I remember, amidst burnt-out buildings, the act of reaching over and locking my car door, shutting out the misery in what can only be described as a cocoon of false security. It was the first time in my life that I had done such a thing. I remembered the gated communities of South Florida as people with tremendous wealth lived behind walls while they drove beyond the ordered palm trees, driving quickly past the methadone clinics, the impoverished trying to sell us flowers or water or standing with signs begging for help. Then, as my mind turned to Milwaukee, I remembered not seeing the lemonade stands on the west side. I thought of the articles that established Milwaukee as the most segregated city in America, and I remembered the African American children driven into communities on the North Shore on Halloween in order to trick or treat, because too often the communities in the inner city are too unsafe to go door to door. And I answered my friends, there's a lot of anger. It's been smoldering for some time now. I'm surprised it has taken this long to build into a fire. Race, racism, prejudice, subjects we are terribly uncomfortable dealing with in polite conversation. We are too often silent in the face of these challenges. We too often deny that racism or prejudice exists, or that they might exist, but we refuse to acknowledge that we may be a part of the problem. Whether or not we care to admit it, and on this day of Yom Kippur, we must admit what is real. It has been a powder keg for some time. In fact, when I first assumed the position of senior rabbi, I looked back at some of the sermons of our founding rabbi, Harry Pastor. I was struck when I read a sermon he delivered on November 15th, 1963, entitled, "We Pay for Our Prejudice." With the exception of language that was common during its time, it could have been written today. He wrote, "What is our attitude going to be, and what are we going to do? Are white people going to continue to pay the high price for our prejudice, or are we going to be willing to work for changes in our own attitudes and improvements in the whole situation?" Rabbi Pastor continued to say, "What do I mean when I refer to the price we pay for prejudice? Well, Booker T. Washington, one of the greatest of African Americans, said, 'You can't hold a man down in the gutter unless you stay down with him.' And we can't keep the black community living in squalid ghettos, and we cannot keep them deprived of equal education and employment opportunities. And we can't keep them the victims of social discrimination without lowering the spiritual and moral and physical and economic level of our whole community. If we do nothing to help our black brothers and sisters, if we wash our hands of their problems, which are our problems, we will pay the price in our community of increasing crime and illiteracy and disease, and we will be affected by these things as well as they. And above all, we will pay the price in loss of human resources in our community, and the loss of all the tremendous talent and contributions these people will be able to make if we help them to reach this level." Rabbi Pastor's sermon was prophetic in every sense of the word. We pay for our prejudice. We do. For now we find ourselves still in the battle for civil rights. And though the laws have changed, and though we have seen a president who identifies as an African American, the system that we live in and benefit from is still prejudicial. It is still stacked against our neighbors. Rabbi Pastor wrote his sermon over 52 years ago, 12 years longer than our ancestors wandered in the wilderness on the journey to the Promised Land. Our ancestors, after being freed from slavery, met many people and peoples along the path to the fulfillment of our promise. There were those who blessed us on our way, and there were those who cursed us on our way. There were some who placed barriers between us and our freedom, and there were those who were trusted advisors and friends. And now it is we who have the privilege of watching a people's march from the shackles of slavery to the fulfillment of their promise. Who will we be on their journey? I want to be clear, I'm not comfortable with who we are right now on their journey. In the 60s, when our congregations, our leaders, and our rabbis marched side by side with men and women of all colors, when our young people risked their very lives to make sure that the promise of the founders, that all men are created equal, would be made a reality, when we risked our well-being for the sake of others as a spiritual affirmation of our tradition's best teachings, and our lived historical experience with these actions, I took great pride. But we have been quiet, all too quiet of late in the face of injustice. And I ask you tonight, have we turned our back on our sacred obligations? When we rise and face east towards the Promised Land, towards Jerusalem, our holy city, we do so not to merely indicate a directional attitude to a place on a map, signifying a comfort zone. If that were all we were doing, it would be clear that we would be turning our back on tackling the problems in the here and now. We would be turning our backs on the Milwaukee that lies to the west of us. We would be turning our backs on the prophetic injunction to be a light unto the nations. Rather, we stand facing east as a reflection of the centrality of the lessons and values learned in that place. For those values never allowed us to feel comfortable. Those values charged us, as Isaiah did, speaking the word of God, speaking to us on this day of atonement, wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, relieve the oppressed. We must be seekers of justice and relievers of the oppressed, for there is much injustice in the world around us. There is much to relieve among the oppressed. I, like you, watched in horror throughout the summer as news reports informed us of unarmed black men being shot to death in interactions with the police, sparking what appears to be a very difficult conversation in this country about policing and race and privilege. I grew up understanding that the responsibility of the police force was to serve and protect. And I always felt and continue to hope that the safety I feel when I see a police officer is not just a result of my skin color. They are protecting us today, and for that I am tremendously grateful. So many police officers do their jobs with nobility and dedication, and they deserve our respect and thanks for the extraordinarily difficult and dangerous and stressful work they do. However, there is a real problem when the experience of our neighbors leads them to feel neither served nor protected. I hope these were all just horrible and tragic mistakes, but we must ask ourselves why this keeps happening. Recently, there was a Vanity Fair article that compiled 18 different academic studies, legal rulings, and media investigations on police and racial bias. The results reinforce the feeling among the African American community that there is racial bias in how policing in many American cities is conducted today. I want to make it clear that there isn't just racial bias in policing. There's racial bias in our hearts. I noticed something about myself while watching those videos and while hearing those reports about the shootings. It reminded me of the self who reached out and locked the doors all those years ago in Cincinnati. I thought to myself, maybe there was a reason. Each and every time a report of a shooting occurred, I thought to myself, what did this person do to make those officers shoot? Asking myself that question exposes a deep prejudice. And we all have prejudices. If we, on this Day of Atonement, search our hearts, you'll find them. They may have manifested upon seeing some teenagers roughhousing in a mall, and we may have grabbed our purse a little tighter, or checked again to make sure that the car was locked when seeing someone of a different color on the street. Or we may have said nothing as the store clerk followed an African American around the store to make sure they wouldn't steal. Did we speak up, or did our silence speak for us? On this Yom Kippur, we acknowledge our errors, those intentional and those that are unintentional. It occurred to me when I identified my prejudice that I do not understand our neighbor's experience. I have no frame of reference, for I have not done the one thing that I am obligated to do, to show my neighbors, as I am commanded to do, that I love them. As I discussed on Rosh Hashanah, to do that is to listen to what grieves them. It was then that I called upon Fred Royal, the president of the NAACP, to offer my support and my help. And when talking with Mr. Royal, we spoke of many issues that demand attention: fair housing, helping to fix the social safety net, providing quality education, addressing discrimination, and more. And frankly, they were all the same issues that Rabbi Pastor identified 52 years ago. Tomorrow, Fred Royal and Steve Moffick will join me in our afternoon study session at 1:30 to help answer the questions how we can be friends and allies to the African American community. I want you to know that I plan on advocating for the vulnerable in our community, wherever they may be. I've been given a charge by my teachers and the rabbis who have come before me, particularly at this congregation, with Rabbi Pastor's words and the tireless work of Rabbi Shapiro. My charge is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. We Jews have experienced severe wounds throughout our history, and it's incumbent upon us to help those who experience pain like ours. We're particularly obligated because for the majority of Jews in this country, we've been given the means to pass. We've been given the means to benefit from white privilege. I know that's hard to hear and hard to accept, and I struggle with it too. After all, we have historically experienced so much pain, but America has afforded us the ability to pull ourselves up. This nation has not done so with our neighbors. There's a beautiful story from the Talmud that illustrates this point. It came to me by way of Rabbi Samuel Karf. When Rabbi Yochanan was ailing, Rabbi Hanina came to visit him. Hanina asked, "Are your sufferings dear to you? Do you accept them as some form of chastisements of the divine love?" And Yochanan replied, "Neither they nor their reward." Whereupon Hanina took Yochanan's hand and healed him. At a later date, Yochanan switched roles. He was now the one that visited an ailing colleague and offered the hand of healing comfort. And the Talmud then asks, in each case, why didn't the ailing rabbis heal themselves? The answer, a prisoner cannot free himself from the prison. When we are ailing in body or spirit, we aren't helped by telling our troubles to ourselves. We may be helped by telling our troubles to a caring, responsive other, by feeling another's hand. And so I'm asking you to help me. Help me to love our neighbor, to reach out our hands, to find out what is grieving them. It's time that we sit and talk and learn about the pain that we each have. And to that end, I've begun to reach out to African American churches to begin a monthly dialogue group with no agenda other than to learn about each other, to learn about each other's griefs and joys and form friendships, and maybe, just maybe, free each other from our prisons. I'm asking you to help me by understanding that it's a false dichotomy choosing between black and blue. Police don't enter into service to be pitted against anyone. They enter into service to be guardians, not warriors. They deserve the tools necessary to provide that noble service to all our communities. And there are methods and practices that the police could use to improve their work and even their job satisfaction. And I'm certain that we'll be examining these methods tomorrow at our study session with Fred Royal. I'm asking you to help me to engage with our Social Action Committee and with our Social Justice Committee to think and work towards racial equality. I know that it conveys meaning when a rabbi shows up to represent the community when a moral voice is needed. It conveys more meaning when his or her congregation shows up with them. I'm asking you to help me. Help me to make sure that 52 years from now, in the year 2068, no rabbi will dig this sermon out of the files of the congregation and deliver any of the words or sentiments shared with you today. Let this sermon become archaic, out of date, a historical anecdote that bears no similarities to what will be their present day. Our neighbors are suffering. We dare not look away, for we have been sufferers too. Those wounds, those fractures of anti-Semitism, the fractures of pogroms and the Holocaust persist and crack our hard exteriors. Those wounds, those fractures, and those cracks are sacred. For it was Leonard Cohen who sang to us that there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So may the cracks in our exteriors serve the divine purpose of allowing the light to enter our hearts. May we always extend our hand in friendship as our neighbors march to the land of promise. And may we, the inheritors of our prophetic tradition, help realize the day when children of all color and all neighborhoods will sit at lemonade stands, refreshing our souls. Kei Nihi Ratzon. May this be God's will.